Hi, this is Bob Hatton from Germany. We're continuing talking about the resurrection of Jesus. Yesterday we had a look at Paul, who said that he'd also met this risen Jesus. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, he tells us a little bit about the resurrection. And he tells us that if Jesus isn't risen from the dead, then our preaching is in vain. And if Jesus isn't risen from the dead, then even our faith is in vain. Forget it, go home, there's nothing. But he goes on in this chapter to assert Jesus is risen from the dead, and this is the hinge of Christianity. This is the hinge of our faith. In fact, in verse 19, he says, if we only have hope in this life, and I think it's great if we have hope in this life, if we are people with hope in this life, that is something wonderful. But he says, if you only have hope in this life, you are to be pitied, because we Christians have hope for the life to come. There is hope after death. Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. If you believe in me, even though you die, you will still live. Knowing Jesus, living with Jesus, means that we have a life after death. We have a life in eternity. During the 18th century, there were two men that shook England, shook the British Isles, and also Europe. They were two brothers. One was called Charles and the other was called John Wesley. And Charles Wesley, he wrote about 6,000 hymns during his lifetime. And John Wesley, I don't know for how many years, but for many decades, he preached every day about 5 times. And they changed the life in these countries. They also influenced Europe. They are the founders of the Methodist Church. Later, many social changes would come into society because of this church, because of the work of the Wesley brothers. Now, John Wesley, he lived to a grand old age of 81. And I think the Sunday before he died, he was preaching. But when he was on his deathbed, and just a few minutes before he died, the very last words he spoken, he said, the best thing is that Jesus is with us. And then he went to be with his Maker. His younger brother, Charles, died about 3 years previously. And shortly before his death, he wrote his very last hymn. It only has 6 lines. I'd like to read that to you. Just remember, he's very old and feeble. He's lying on his deathbed, and he would die 3 days later. And he wrote, in age and feebleness extreme, who shall an helpless worm redeem? Jesus, my only hope thou art, strength of my failing flesh and heart. Oh, could I catch one smile from thee and drop into eternity. And 3 days later, he died and dropped into eternity to be with Jesus, who was smiling at him. A modern day writer, hymn writer, songwriter, he was inspired by this short hymn of Charles Wesley, and he wrote one of the verses in the famous song 10,000 Reasons. He wrote one of the verses inspired by Charles Wesley, and that's the last verse. And he says, and on that day when my strength is failing, the end draws near and my time has come, still my soul will sing your praise unending, 10,000 years and forevermore. Isn't it wonderful that we have hope after death? We have hope in this life, but we have hope also in the life to come. An American by the name of Nick Ripkin works in Africa, and he felt that God had called him to work in the country of Somalia. Now, Somalia is a very dangerous, lawless country, and it's dangerous for Westerners, but it's also dangerous for Christians. And so he found he couldn't live there permanently, but he lived in Kenya, in Nairobi, and he would journey into that country. And he started to do some work. It was difficult to do missionary work, so he was doing some development aid, and he got a team. And his family was living in Nairobi, and he would go there for a few days, and he would come back, and a month later he would go again, but continually traveling, going to and fro. In Nairobi, one of his children got sick, and he writes that in a book that he's written about his story, The Insanity of God. And he tells a story about how his son then eventually dies, a very dramatic story. So inform the people in Somalia he wouldn't be coming for the next appointment that he had. He couldn't make it because his son had died, and he must attend to his funeral. Now, on the morning of the funeral, or the family is just about to leave to go to the church and accompany the boy to the cemetery, somebody knocked at the door, and they went there, and it was some of the guys from Somalia. They'd come to stand with them at this difficult time. They'd walked all the way from Somalia, a couple of hundred kilometers, a couple of 100 miles. They'd walked all the way there to be with their friend. And they attended the funeral. After the funeral had finished, they then left and they walked back to Somalia. A short time later, the situation in Somalia deteriorated completely, and they decided that they couldn't continue working in Somalia. So the author went to that country, and he said that he was not going to be able to come back because the situation is so difficult, and he wanted to say goodbye to the people. And then they started to ask him, and they said, you know, we were so impressed when we came to visit you and attended your son's funeral. Everybody was saying goodbye, we'll see you again. This is not a farewell forever. We will see you again with Jesus. He's now living with Jesus, and all these kind of things. That it's impressed us so much, because you know, the death is not a stranger to us. We have so much violence in our country. We have a lot of hunger in our country. There's a lot of disease in our country. People are always dying. We know death. We know the funerals, but in our funerals we have no hope. In our funerals we don't know what is going to happen. Maybe there is a life beyond the grave, but it's a life of terror. It's a life that we are frightened of dying. But your life, your faith, it gave us hope. In the end, they celebrated communion with one another, and the author of the book, he had to leave them. But we do have hope after death. Life doesn't finish here. One day we are old, and then we have to leave. Sometimes young people must leave earlier, but life goes on. Before it, I just want to challenge you, and I just want to ask you that you make sure that you have this relationship to God. It's not about doing lots of good things, but it's about trusting, putting your trust in the Lord. Maybe you would like to commit your life to the Lord. Thank you for watching this morning. I wish you a good day and all the best. Bob Hatton from Germany.